Under the golden lights of the hall, the air carried the scent of expensive perfume and polished wood. The grand chandelier sparkled above, casting glittering patterns across marble floors. Wealthy men in tailored suits and women in sparkling gowns filled the space. Their laughter echoed like music, each voice competing with another to show off their importance. At the center of it all stood the millionaire, a man whose name carried weight in business circles. He loved to host parties, not only to show his riches but to remind everyone how powerful he was. For him, the evening was not about music or joy. It was about control. Every glance he gave was sharp. Every word spoken was meant to impress or intimidate. Guests admired his mansion, his art, his wine. But what he enjoyed the most was the feeling that everyone present was beneath him. People laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. They praised his collections even when they barely understood them. The hall itself seemed to exist to feed his pride. The employees moved quietly in the background, carrying trays of food, filling glasses, cleaning unnoticed corners. They blended into the scene like shadows. Their task was simple: serve and stay silent. None of them dared to cross the fine line between worker and guest. Among them was a young woman, dressed in the plain uniform of service staff. Her steps were careful, her eyes lowered. She had worked in the mansion long enough to know how dangerous it was to draw attention. But the millionaire noticed everything. He noticed not because he cared, but because it gave him pleasure to remind the workers of their place. That night, as he raised his glass and entertained his wealthy companions, his eyes swept across the room and landed on her. A thought formed, another chance to display his power. His lips curled into a smile that did not reach his eyes. The guests spoke of wealth, of art, of culture. They admired the grand piano resting like a jewel in the corner of the hall. Its polished surface gleamed, untouched yet waiting. Someone joked about how music could elevate the evening. The millionaire chuckled, his mind already spinning with a cruel idea. What better entertainment, he thought, than forcing one of his workers to stumble before such a refined instrument. He remembered the quiet girl, the one who never spoke up. Her silence to him was weakness. He enjoyed exposing weakness. To him, humiliation was sport, and the laughter of his guests was the prize. With a snap of his fingers, he summoned her forward. The hall grew quiet as the young woman froze in her steps. A tray in her hand trembled slightly. Her heart quickened. She was not used to standing before so many eyes. The guests turned to see who he had called. Their curious eyes fell on her. Some smiled knowingly, already expecting a show of clumsy failure. She walked slowly, each step heavy like iron. She wanted to disappear into the shadows, yet there was no escape. The millionaire's voice rang loud and sharp, commanding her toward the piano. His words carried mockery, suggesting that she should entertain the guests. Her hands grew cold. She had never been forced into the spotlight before. The workers were invisible, meant to blend, not shine, yet now, every gaze in the room pierced through her. The piano stood before her like a mountain, beautiful yet terrifying. The laughter behind her stung her ears. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, eyes glittering with cruel amusement. Inside, the girl felt a storm. Fear tangled with anger. She had been mocked before, treated as invisible, looked down upon, but this was different. This was not quiet cruelty behind closed doors. This was open humiliation. And the man before her expected her to fail, expected her to break under the weight of judgment. In that moment, she stood at the edge of choice, either remain the victim of his cruel game or reveal something no one expected. She did not know yet what courage would guide her, but the spark inside her heart had begun to burn. The hall, the guests, the millionaire, none of them knew what was about to awaken. The night that began with glittering chandeliers and shallow laughter was about to change. A single command to humiliate a worker would soon turn into a memory none of them would ever forget. She stood in the corner of the hall, her uniform plain and simple, blending with the walls so no one would notice her. For months she had worked in the mansion, cleaning, serving food, and moving quietly so the rich guests would not even remember her face. She was used to being invisible. It was safer that way. The less attention she drew, the easier it was to finish her work without trouble. But life had a strange way of pushing people into the light when they least wanted it. That evening, as she carried a tray of drinks across the shining floor, her heart was calm. She told herself she just needed to get through the night, watch the clock and wait until the guests left. She had dreams, of course, but dreams had no place in the glittering mansion. The mansion was a world of power, wealth, and pride, things she did not belong to, so she stayed silent, listening to the laughter of people who never once asked for her name. Her life before the mansion had not been easy. She had grown up in a small neighborhood. Far from luxury, her family struggled with money, and many times she had to sacrifice her own wishes just to help at home. She had learned to be strong in silence, to work hard without complaint. The mansion was only a job, but sometimes it felt like a cage, reminding her of how small she appeared in the eyes of the rich. Yet those who looked closely would see something different in her. She was not weak, she was not ordinary. Behind her quiet steps lived a hidden spark, a gift she never revealed. For years she had practiced piano on an old keyboard someone had given her. Music was her secret language, a place where her soul felt free. But no one in the mansion knew this. To them, she was only the quiet girl, another worker in the background. As the guests laughed and the millionaire's voice boomed across the room, her world suddenly changed. He called her name, and the sound cut through her heart like a blade. At first she thought she had made a mistake with the drinks. Maybe she spilled something. Maybe he was about to scold her. But the smirk on his face told her this was different. It was not about the tray or the service, it was about him choosing her as the evening's entertainment. The guests turned their heads, eyes filled with curiosity. Some smiled, expecting a show. Others whispered, already amused by what they imagined would happen. She felt heat rise in her face, her feet moved slowly, unwillingly. Each step forward was heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of their judgment before she even reached the piano. The millionaire leaned back in his seat, his gold watch shining under the chandelier. He looked at her the way one looks at a bug, something small, something to play with. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he told her to sit. Play for us, he said loudly. Show us your talent. The room erupted in soft laughter. It was clear they did not expect talent. They expected mistakes, they expected her hands to stumble, and her face to burn with shame. Her heart pounded in her chest, the piano loomed before her, its polished surface glowing. To her, the instrument was not only intimidating, it was sacred. She had dreamed of touching such a piano for years, but never imagined it would happen like this, not with mocking eyes and cruel laughter surrounding her. She hesitated, fingers trembling slightly. A part of her wanted to run, to escape into the shadows where she belonged. But another part of her whispered differently. That whisper reminded her of the nights she spent alone, playing on her small keyboard, pouring her soul into melodies when no one else cared. That whisper told her she was more than a servant, more than a joke. She was a musician, a dreamer, a fighter. The guests waited, their amusement growing with her silence. Every second stretched long and heavy. She knew if she refused, the humiliation would be worse. If she tried and failed, it would be the same. But if she dared, if she truly dared, something greater might happen. Her hands hovered above the keys. Cold and unsteady, the millionaire smirked. Raising his glass, he was sure she would embarrass herself. He was sure the evening would end with laughter at her expense. He could not see the fire slowly waking inside her. He could not hear the music already playing in her heart. In that moment, she stopped hearing the whispers, stopped seeing the mocking smiles. Instead, she remembered her childhood, the nights of practicing until her fingers hurt, the way music gave her strength when everything else failed. The piano was no longer a tool of humiliation. It was her voice, her truth, her shield. She took a deep breath. Her fear did not vanish, but it transformed into determination. If she was to be forced into the spotlight, she would not stand there as a victim. She would stand as herself, the young woman, once invisible in the grand hall, was about to show a room full of doubters who she truly was. And in the quiet before her first note, the entire hall held its breath, waiting for a mistake, unaware that what they were about to hear would change everything. The room was heavy with silence. The millionaire's command echoed in her ears. His voice was sharp, filled with pride, and his smirk told everyone what he wanted. He did not call her to honor her. He called her to embarrass her. He wanted his guests to laugh. He wanted to show them how powerless she was. He walked toward the piano slowly, her feet dragging against the marble floor. Every step sounded louder than the music the guests had been enjoying earlier. Her eyes lowered. The room was heavy with silence. He called her to embarrass her. He wanted his guests to laugh. He wanted to show them how powerless she was. He walked toward the piano slowly, Her feet dragging against the marble floor, every step sounded louder than the music the guests had been enjoying earlier. Her eyes lowered, but she could still feel their stares. Dozens of eyes, sharp as knives. Some were curious, some were amused. But none believed she could surprise them. She was only a servant, and servants were never expected to shine. The piano sat at the corner of the hall, untouched the whole evening. Its polished black surface glistened under the chandelier. It was not just an instrument, it was a symbol to the millionaire. It was a decoration to display wealth to the guests. It was a reminder of culture and class, but to her, it was something more. Something she had always dreamed of. She had played music in secret for years. On an old keyboard with missing keys, she had taught herself notes, learning from scraps of books and listening to melodies on a small radio. Music was her secret escape, her only joy after long hours of work. But here, before these mocking faces, music was no longer a safe friend. It was a weapon placed in her hands by a cruel man. The millionaire leaned back in his chair. His golden ring tapped against the glass in his hand. He whispered something to the guest beside him, and they both chuckled. He believed the outcome was certain. He believed she would fumble and the hall would echo with laughter. This was his game, and he had chosen his target well. Her hands trembled as she reached the piano. She sat on the bench, her uniform too plain against the grandeur of the instrument. Her heart thumped so loud she thought others might hear it. She wanted to disappear, to run away, but escape was impossible. All doors were closed by the eyes of the audience, and the millionaire's pride blocked every path out. The guests whispered. Their voices were soft, but each word burned. She doesn't know how to play, one said. This will be fun, another replied. Their laughter was not loud yet, but it was ready, waiting for the mistake. The moment hung between humiliation and surprise. She closed her eyes for a second. Her breath was uneven. Memories rushed back. Late nights with her keyboard, when no one listened, when no one judged, when her fingers flew across the keys. She was not poor, she was not invisible. She was alive, she was free. Her hands hovered above the piano. The silence deepened. The millionaire's smirk widened. He thought she was frozen, too scared to even begin. He was certain this little performance would end in shame. But he did not know the storm building inside her chest. Her fear began to turn into anger. Anger at being mocked, anger at being seen as nothing. Anger at being treated like a toy for someone else's pride. That anger did not push her down. It lifted her, it whispered to her, "Show them." She touched the first key, the sound was soft, almost trembling. A few guests snickered, thinking this would be her downfall. But then the second note came, then the third. And slowly the melody formed. It was not clumsy. It was smooth. It was alive. Her fingers, once shaking, began to move with certainty. The music inside her heart poured out through the grand piano, filling the hall with something none of them expected. The laughter died instantly. The whispers fell silent. The guests leaned forward, their eyes wide. The millionaire's smirk faded, replaced by confusion. The sound was not the sound of humiliation. It was beauty, it was power. She forgot about the crowd. She forgot about the cruel man watching her. In that moment, it was only her and the music. Her fingers danced across the keys as if they had been waiting for this moment all her life. Each note carried her story, the pain of her struggles, the strength she had built, the dreams she had buried. The hall transformed. It was no longer a cage, it was her stage. The same piano that was meant to humiliate her became her voice. It sang of freedom. It silenced cruelty. It demanded respect. The guests could no longer see her as just a servant. They saw her as an artist, someone extraordinary hidden in plain sight. The millionaire sat frozen. His plan was broken. His pride crushed by the very girl he wanted to destroy. He wanted laughter, but all he gave the world was silence and awe. As the final notes of her melody echoed through the grand hall, the young woman who had been invisible was invisible no more. She had not only played the piano, she had turned humiliation into triumph. She had stolen the night from the millionaire and claimed it as her own. The hall was filled with silence that felt heavier than stone. A moment ago, the room had been alive with cruel laughter and whispers, but now not a single voice dared to rise above the sound of her music. She sat before the piano, her back straight, her eyes closed, her fingers gliding over the keys like they were born for this moment. The young woman who had been invisible all evening was now the center of the universe. The guests who had once expected to be entertained by her failure leaned forward in their seats. Their eyes widened, their lips parted. They had been ready to laugh at her clumsy mistakes. But what they heard instead was magic. Each note touched something deep inside them. The melody was not just music, it carried feelings. Stories, pain, and hope. It was raw, honest, and alive. The kind of music no money could buy. The millionaire, who had orchestrated her humiliation, sat frozen in disbelief. His glass of wine stopped halfway to his lips. His smirk had melted away, replaced by something he rarely showed: shock. He had planned to use her as a joke, to show the guests that he had power over not only their attention, but also the dignity of his employees. Yet the game had turned against him in trying to crush her. He had given her the stage she deserved. The young woman felt the stares. But they no longer frightened her. They fueled her. For years she had played in secret, hiding her talent like a precious treasure, afraid the world would mock it. But now the music poured out of her like a flood, unstoppable and undeniable. She was no longer the quiet worker carrying trays in the background. She was a musician, commanding the attention of every soul in the room. Each note grew stronger, more confident. The melody rose and fell like waves, soft and delicate one moment, then fierce and powerful the next. It painted pictures in the minds of the listeners of struggles fought in silence, of dreams born in shadows, of beauty found in the most unlikely places. The guests sat speechless, some even holding their breath, as if exhaling might break the spell. Even the servants who had been moving quietly in the background stopped to listen. For them, it was not only music, it was justice. It was the voice of one of their own rising above the cruelty of the rich. They felt pride swell in their hearts. She was showing them that they were not powerless, that even in a place built to belittle them, greatness could still bloom. The millionaire's face grew darker with every passing second. He could not interrupt her. To do so would expose his weakness. His guests were captivated. Their admiration for her talent grew, and with it, his control over the room slipped away. For the first time in a long time, he was not the center of attention. The music continued, filling every corner of the grand hall. It danced along the marble floors, climbed the golden walls, and soared toward the glittering chandelier. The notes did not just echo, they lingered, wrapping themselves around the hearts of everyone present. The cruel laughter that once filled the room seemed like a distant memory, replaced by awe. She played as though she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. The piano was no longer a trap set by a cruel man. It was her freedom. Her truth. She had nothing to prove to him anymore. She played because she wanted to, because her soul demanded it, and in doing so, she took back her dignity and turned his cruelty into her triumph. When her fingers slowed and the last gentle note floated into the air, the hall remained silent for a long, trembling moment. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had paused to honor her. Then slowly the silence broke into thunderous applause. The guests who had expected to laugh now rose from their seats, clapping with genuine admiration. Their eyes no longer looked at her with amusement, but with respect. The young woman lifted her head, her cheeks flushed, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of her breath. She had not only survived the humiliation, she had turned it into victory. She had spoken without words, and her message was louder than any insult. She was more than a servant, more than a shadow in a grand house. She was someone whose talent could not be silenced. The millionaire remained seated, his hands still, his face pale. He had been defeated not by wealth, not by status, but by something he could never control: true talent. His attempt at humiliation had only exposed his own emptiness. And the room knew it. The applause was not for him. The admiration no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the girl he tried to break, and she had risen higher than he could ever imagine. That night, the hall would be remembered not for its glittering chandelier, not for its expensive wine, and not for the arrogance of its master. It would be remembered for the moment when a quiet servant played the piano and silenced cruelty with beauty. A moment when music became power, and truth became louder than pride. Her fingers touched the keys again, and this time the sound was stronger, clearer, more powerful. The first notes had carried her fear, but now the music carried her courage. The room was no longer a hall of judgment. It was a stage, and she was no longer a servant hiding in shadows. She was an artist standing in the light. The melody grew like a fire, soft sparks turning into bright flames. Each note echoed against the marble walls, rising higher, filling every corner. The guests who had once leaned back in amusement now leaned forward in awe. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by wide eyes and still hands. They had expected clumsy noise, but instead they received beauty. They had prepared for humiliation, but instead they found inspiration. She closed her eyes as she played. She was no longer in the mansion, no longer surrounded by people who doubted her. In her heart, she was back in her small room, with her old broken keyboard, playing to herself, playing to forget her struggles, playing to dream of a world bigger than the one she lived in. The music lifted her above her pain, above her loneliness, above every cruel word ever spoken to her. The piano became her voice, and her voice spoke louder than any words could. It told the story of her hardships, of nights spent working instead of sleeping, of days filled with silence when no one noticed her efforts. But it also told of hope, of the strength she carried within, of the fire that refused to die even when life tried to crush it. Each note was like a piece of her soul. Raw and unhidden, the guests felt it. They did not just hear music. They felt the emotions pouring out of her. Some closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them. Some stared, unable to believe that a girl they had overlooked all evening could command such power. For a moment they forgot their pride, their wealth, their arrogance. For a moment, they were simply listeners, humbled by the truth of her music. The millionaire sat stiffly in his chair. His fingers tightened around his glass. His jaw clenched. He had wanted to see her stumble, to watch her shrink under the weight of shame, but instead he saw her rise higher and higher with every note. His plan had slipped out of his control, and the room that once belonged to him now belonged to her. Every guest who clapped for him earlier now stared at her. Every whisper of flattery that once surrounded him was gone. Their eyes no longer admired his wealth, they admired her courage. The power he loved so dearly had been taken from him, not by another rich man, not by another deal, but by a girl he thought was beneath him. The music built stronger. Her fingers moved faster. Her body swayed with the rhythm. She poured everything she had into the piano, holding nothing back. The more she played, the more she forgot her fear. She was not playing to impress them anymore. She was playing because it was who she was. Her music was not a mask, it was her truth. And the truth was undeniable. It silenced arrogance, it erased laughter. It reminded everyone that greatness can come from anywhere, even from the most unexpected places. The guests began to feel something shift in their hearts. Some felt shame for how quickly they had judged her. Others felt respect, genuine respect, the kind they rarely gave to anyone outside their circle of wealth. The hall, which had been filled with shallow pride, now carried something rare and pure, admiration. Even the servants who stood at the edges of the room felt their hearts swell. They had always walked quietly, heads down, but tonight one of their own had risen. She was playing not just for herself, but for all of them. She was proving that no amount of cruelty could erase the light hidden within them. The millionaire could not hide his discomfort. He shifted in his seat, his forced smile tight. His plan had failed, but worse than that, he had been exposed. Everyone could see it now. He was small despite his wealth. He was powerless despite his influence. And the girl he had tried to humiliate had become the one to silence him. As the music reached its peak, the hall vibrated with energy. It was as though the piano itself had come alive. Every note struck the hearts of the listeners like a spark. Leaving them breathless, she was no longer just playing. She was commanding, she was leading the room, and everyone followed. Then, slowly, her fingers began to soften. The fire of her melody eased into a gentle glow. The powerful waves of sound turned into a calm river. Carrying peace through the hall, the guests, who had been holding their breath, now let out soft sighs. Some even felt tears well in their eyes. The music had touched them in ways they did not expect, and as the final soft note lingered in the air, it felt as if time itself had stopped. The applause did not come immediately, because the people needed a moment to return from where her music had taken them. They looked at her, not as a servant, not as a girl forced into the spotlight, but as an artist, someone greater than the pride of the man who owned the mansion. The silence before the clapping began was louder than any laughter the millionaire had hoped for. It was the silence of respect, the silence of realization, the silence that marked the moment when a quiet, invisible worker became unforgettable. The hall had transformed. A place that only moments ago had been filled with arrogance and shallow laughter was now wrapped in a heavy silence. The last notes of her music still floated in the air like whispers that refused to die. The young woman lifted her hands from the piano, and for a heartbeat the room did not move. The guests sat frozen, their eyes wide, their breath held, as if they had witnessed something far greater than a simple performance. Then slowly, as if released from a spell, the silence broke. It began with a single clap, hesitant yet filled with awe. Then another followed, and another, until the hall erupted with thunderous applause. The walls shook with the force of it. Guests stood to their feet, their faces glowing with admiration. Some clapped with wide smiles, some with eyes shining with emotion. They had come expecting to be entertained by cruelty, but instead they had witnessed beauty that touched their souls. The young woman, still seated at the piano, lowered her gaze, her cheeks burned red. Not from shame this time, but from disbelief. She had never heard applause like this, never imagined people of such high status would cheer for her. For so long she had been invisible, moving silently through the mansion's halls. Now she was the brightest light in the room, and everyone's eyes were on her, not with mockery but with respect. The servants who stood along the walls watched with pride swelling in their hearts. They had often felt powerless, treated as shadows in the world of the rich, but tonight one of their own had changed everything. Her courage was theirs, her victory was theirs. They looked at her not only as a colleague but as a symbol of hope, proof that dignity could rise even in the harshest of places. The millionaire sat stiffly in his chair, his glass of wine untouched, his jaw tight. He could not join in the applause. His pride would not allow it. Every clap was a slap to his ego, every cheer a reminder of his failure. He had wanted the night to end with laughter at her expense, but instead it ended with him humiliated. His guests no longer looked at him with admiration. They looked past him toward her. The power he had always commanded had slipped through his fingers like sand. He tried to smile, but it was thin, empty. His eyes darted around the room, searching for control, but there was none left. The applause was not his, the admiration was not his. It all belonged to the girl he had tried to crush, and that truth ate at him like poison. The guests, however, did not care for his discomfort. They walked closer to the piano, speaking to one another with excitement. "Who is she?" One whispered, "Where did she learn to play like that?" Another asked. They could not believe such talent had been hidden in the plain clothes of a servant. They spoke of her as if she were a rare jewel suddenly revealed. Their voices carried awe, not ridicule. The young woman stood slowly, her legs trembling. The applause still thundered. But inside she felt calm, a calm she had never known. She had faced humiliation and turned it into triumph. She had stood before those who thought nothing of her and shown them her truth. She had silenced cruelty without a single word, only with music. For the first time, she allowed herself to lift her head and look around the hall. She did not look with fear, she looked with quiet strength. Her eyes met those of the guests, and she saw no mockery there, only respect. Some even nodded at her as if bowing to her courage. That small acknowledgement filled her with more pride than any riches could. The millionaire felt the eyes too. He felt the shift. He was no longer the star of the evening, no longer the voice that commanded the room. He had been silenced, and not by another man of wealth or influence, but by the very person he had thought powerless. It was a wound his pride could not heal. The music had changed the room. It had turned judgment into admiration, cruelty into respect, silence into thunder. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with arrogance. It was alive with inspiration. Guests whispered about how unforgettable the night had become. They knew they would tell the story again and again. The story of the girl who sat at the piano and made everyone forget themselves. But the young woman did not play for fame or recognition. She had played because her heart demanded it, because in that moment it was the only thing she could do. She had not planned to defeat the millionaire or to win the admiration of strangers. All she wanted was to survive. Yet in surviving she had done something much greater. She had risen. She had proved that dignity, courage, and truth were stronger than cruelty. As the applause finally began to fade, the air remained charged with the memory of her music. The guests returned to their seats, their faces still glowing. But the night would not return to what it had been. Something had shifted forever. The young woman walked quietly away from the piano, but every step she took was heavier with meaning. She was no longer invisible. She carried with her the respect of a room that had once been ready to laugh at her pain. The millionaire watched her leave the piano with a storm brewing inside him. He knew the night had slipped from his control. He knew his plan to humiliate her had backfired. And though he sat in silence, burning with shame, he could not erase what had happened. For in that grand hall before his very eyes, his pride had been destroyed by the one person he least expected. The hall would never forget it. The guests would never forget it. And most of all, she would never forget it. The night that began as an attempt to shame her had become the night she found her voice. The night she silenced cruelty with nothing but music. The millionaire sat stiff in his chair. His fingers tapped against the glass he had forgotten to drink from. His face, once full of smug pride, was now frozen and pale. He had never expected the evening to turn like this. He had imagined laughter, humiliation, and his guests praising his sharp wit. Instead, he had been silenced by the very girl he thought too small to matter. She had not spoken a word to him. Yet her music had answered louder than any insult could. The hall was still buzzing with admiration for her. Guests whispered her name, though many had only learned it that night. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others spoke of her like a miracle, and every whisper was a blow to his ego, because the story they would take with them was not of his power, but of her talent. He tried to force a smile, to act as though he had planned the moment. But the truth sat heavy in the eyes of the guests. They had seen his cruelty. They had seen the way he had called her forward, mocking her, daring her to embarrass herself. Now, after her performance, that cruel intention was exposed. He had not lifted her up. She had risen on her own, stronger than he had imagined. Inside him burned a mixture of anger and shame. He was not used to losing. He was not used to being overshadowed. For years he had built his reputation on power and fear. People obeyed him not out of love, but out of intimidation. Yet here, before his own guests, he had been stripped of that control. And what made it worse, it was not by a rich rival, not by another powerful man, but by a girl he had seen as nothing more than a servant. The applause still echoed in his ears. Each clap felt like a reminder of his failure. Each smile directed at her was like a shadow covering his face. He shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, trying to regain some sense of command. But no one was looking at him anymore. The spotlight, invisible yet undeniable, was no longer his, it belonged to her. The young woman, meanwhile, stood quietly near the piano. She did not look at him. She did not need to. Her silence was more powerful than confrontation. She had nothing to prove. The music had spoken for her. It had stripped him of his cruelty and shown the world his weakness. And she, who had entered the evening as invisible, was now unforgettable. The guests began to approach her. Some offered kind words, some asked about her past, some simply smiled with respect. Their voices were soft now, filled with genuine admiration. For them, the evening had transformed from a party of wealth into a memory of inspiration. They would leave remembering her, not him. They would tell others about the girl who silenced arrogance with music. The millionaire clenched his fists under the table. Each conversation directed at her instead of him deepened his humiliation. He wanted to speak, to take back control, but no words came. What could he say? That she had failed? That she had embarrassed herself? No, the truth was undeniable. The truth was ringing in the applause that still echoed through the hall. For years he had believed money could command anything. Respect, fear, admiration. But tonight he learned that there were things money could not buy. He could not buy the talent that poured out of her hands. He could not buy the courage that carried her through humiliation. He could not buy the respect she had earned with nothing but truth. In that moment, he was smaller than he had ever been. The young woman did not gloat. She did not smirk at him or demand acknowledgement. Her quiet dignity cut deeper than any insult could. She did not need revenge. The silence he sat in was revenge enough. She did not need to shout her victory. The music had already shouted it for her. The guests noticed his silence. They noticed how he avoided her eyes. They noticed how his usual confidence was gone. And in their minds, the story was clear. He had tried to break her, but she had broken him instead. The respect they once gave him out of fear began to fade, because fear could not compete with true admiration. The hall seemed different now. The chandeliers still glittered. The marble still shone, but the air was no longer his. It belonged to her. She had changed the space, transformed it with her courage. What had been a stage for his arrogance had become a stage for her triumph. And no matter how hard he tried to reclaim it, he could not. Inside he burned with anger. But he could not show it. To lash out at her now would only expose his defeat further. To attack her would be to admit she had won, so he sat frozen, forced to endure the weight of her quiet victory. And she, standing tall and calm, needed nothing more than her silence to finish what her music had begun. That night he learned something he would never forget. He learned that true power does not come from wealth or control. It comes from courage, from talent, from truth, and he had none of those, she did, and that was why she silenced him without even trying. The young woman, though still shy and unsure of what the future held, carried herself with a new strength. She had faced the storm and turned it into light. She had stood against cruelty and turned it into respect. And while he sat broken in his pride, she walked quietly in her victory, stronger than ever before. The last note of her music had already faded, but its echo still lived in the hearts of everyone inside the hall. The guests could not stop speaking about what they had witnessed. Their words spilled like rushing water, some praising her courage, others amazed at her hidden gift. For many of them, it was the first time they had felt something real in such a place of glitter and pride. The chandeliers still sparkled, the wine still poured, but none of those things mattered anymore. What they would remember was her music. She stood near the piano, her hands folded, her face calm though her heart still raced. She was not used to attention, not used to voices praising her. For years she had been invisible, a shadow moving quietly in the mansion, and now she stood in the center of admiration. It felt unreal, as though she was dreaming with her eyes open. The servants along the walls smiled at her with pride. They had watched her carry trays, sweep floors, and move silently to avoid notice. They had known her as one of them, struggling and surviving. But tonight she had become something greater. She had given them all a gift, proof that they were not powerless, proof that even in the hardest places, one act of courage could change everything. The guests, still glowing with excitement, wanted to know her story. They asked where she had learned to play, who had taught her. They wondered how such talent had been hidden all this time. Some even spoke of her future, imagining her on stages far bigger than the mansion's hall. Their admiration poured over her like sunlight, warming her after years of cold shadows. But the millionaire sat like stone, his eyes dark, his body stiff. He could not share in their joy, he could not smile. He had lost the night, lost his pride, lost the control he valued more than anything. His plan to humiliate her had ended with his own humiliation, and though he remained silent, everyone could see it. His silence was louder than their cheers. His defeat was clear. The young woman did not look at him. She did not need to. He was no longer important. His power had vanished in the sound of her music. She had no desire to see his shame, because her victory was not about him. It was about her, about finding her strength, about refusing to be broken. She stood with quiet dignity, and that dignity spoke louder than any words ever could. As the evening drew on, the guests continued to speak of her. Their conversations shifted away from wealth and pride. They no longer praised the millionaire for his riches. They praised her for her courage. His grand hall had been stolen from him, transformed by her presence, and nothing he did could take it back. For the young woman, the night became a turning point. She had walked into the evening as a servant. Silent and unseen, she had been forced to the piano to be mocked. But she had left her fear behind in every note she played. She had found her voice, not in words, but in music. And that voice had reached hearts, broken pride, and created respect where none had existed before. She returned to her quiet corner later. But she was not the same girl anymore. Something inside her had changed. She now knew her worth. She now understood that her talent was not something to hide. It was a gift, a strength, a light that even cruelty could not extinguish. And with that understanding, she stood taller, walked stronger, and carried herself with pride. The hall would never forget that night. The guests would carry the memory with them, telling others of the girl who silenced arrogance with beauty. The servants would whisper the story among themselves, smiling with hope. And the millionaire, though he tried to bury the memory, would forever be haunted by it. For in his own house, before his own eyes, his pride had been destroyed by the very person he thought unworthy. But for her, it was not about revenge. It was about freedom. Her music had freed her from fear, freed her from invisibility. She had faced humiliation and turned it into honor. She had stood in the light and found she belonged there. When she finally left the piano behind, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. She had no riches, no jewels, no power. But she had something far greater, respect, dignity, and the knowledge that her talent could not be silenced. And that was worth more than anything money could buy. The night that began with cruelty ended with inspiration. The millionaire had tried to humiliate her, but instead he had given her the stage. And with that stage, she had claimed a victory no one could take away. From that day forward, she was no longer remembered as a servant in the shadows. She was remembered as the woman who sat at the piano and silenced arrogance with music. Her name, her story, her courage lived on, not just in the hall, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the moment. And so, with quiet steps and a heart full of strength, she walked away from that night forever changed, for she had proven something timeless, that true power is not in wealth or cruelty, but in courage and dignity, and in the light of talent that refuses to be hidden.